In some of the valuable archive photos and footage about Vietnam's two resistance wars, people will see the image of the Western journalist talking to President Ho Chi Minh, or General Vo Nguyen Giap, or walking with the Vietnamese guerrillas in the fortified hamlets or underground tunnels.
Welcome, Wilfred Burchett.
He wrote many articles about the wars in Vietnam, telling the world the true image of the wars. He raised his voices against the foreign invaders and in support of the justice cause of the Vietnamese people. For his stance beside the Vietnamese people, he had been denied by the then Australian government, and for many years, he and his family had to move around in several countries for a living. He is Wilfred Burchett, a world-acclaimed journalist whose writings are still capturing the audience's attention until today.
Hello there, and welcome to this edition of Talk Vietnam. Wilfred Burchett is a world-acclaimed journalist and a wholehearted friend of the Vietnamese people. Now, although he passed away in 1983 at the age of 72, his legendary support to the Vietnamese people and also to Vietnam still lingers and lives on. And also his works, articles, and dozens of books still much receives the interest of many people in today's society. Now today we're lucky enough to have with us in our studio his son, George Burchett, with us for him to share with us the memories, thoughts, and also the person of his father. So please join me in welcoming George Burchett. Thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure and a great honor.
Wonderful. I heard that you're making this trip this time also to mark the 65th anniversary of Vietnam's National Day. So how has the trip been so far?
It's been it feels like a homecoming, but it's also been a very exciting trip in the sense that I discover a Vietnam that is so full of dynamism and that seems to be forging ahead very confidently towards a very bright future, and you can see it in every aspect of life that I've been able to observe in just the past few days.
For you, you mentioned this trip as almost like a homecoming because this is you coming back to the place where you were born. You were born here in Hanoi in 1955, and after that you stayed here with your family for 2 years. Is that right?
Yep, my dad and mom lived in Hanoi for 2 years, invited by Uncle Ho after the Geneva conference, and that's where I was born. And actually I was born on the day when the last French colonial administrators departed.
Wow.
You know, boarded a ship in Haiphong and sailed down to Saigon. So you can say that I was truly a child of independence.
Exactly. I don't suppose you would remember much from those days.
I don't remember anything specific, but there is some kind of feeling that stays, and I know because my parents were so fond of these 2 years in Vietnam, and they used to tell us about it so much, about the people, the leaders, Ho Chi Minh, Phan Van Dong, General Giap, but also the ordinary people that they were in contact with. So to me, I always have this very warm feeling that stayed with me. And when I was, because from Hanoi we moved to Moscow, where we lived for 8 years. But when my little friends ask me where you're from, I always say I'm Vietnamese. I'm from Hanoi.
Exactly, you were born here.
And then they look at me and say, but you don't look Vietnamese. I say, but I am Vietnamese. I was born there.
Exactly. Yeah. And you're coming back now, and you also nurtured a lot of stories, you said, from your parents about the time here, even though you were just 2 years old.
Well, Vietnam dominated a huge slice of my life because of my father's work. Reporting unfortunately, after reporting the peace, because he wrote quite an interesting book called North of the 17th Parallel, which was about new Vietnam. And then unfortunately he had to write again about war because of the American war, because the Americans replaced the French as the French. Yeah. So So he reported from South Vietnam, from the jungles, and he reported from North Vietnam, as it was when the Americans started bombing in '65. And he wrote many, many books and wrote countless articles and made films and lectured. And we had people from all over the world coming to our house to, you know, all the, you know, people that were involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. So Vietnam was to me a war. It was also an international solidarity movement to stop the war. So it was both a negative and a positive, and but before all, it was a heroic struggle of heroic people led by a legendary, great and very kind person to me, because I had a personal, because of his friendship with my dad, President Ho Chi Minh. So to me, he was my father's greatest hero, political hero, and he's also my great political hero.
So talking about your father's work, there's a biographical film on Burchett entitled Public Enemy Number One, and it was produced in 1981 by Academy Awards nominated filmmaker David Bradbury. Now this film shows how Burchett was vilified not only by the mainstream press, but also the conservative public in Australia for his coverage of the other side in both the Korean as well as the Vietnam Wars. It also asked the question of how far the freedom of the press can be pushed or extended during the wartime. Now, during this visit to Vietnam, his son, George Burchett, has brought this documentary to show to the public here in Vietnam. So in the following, we'll take a look at an extract.
His name is Wilfred Burchett. He's an Australian, but he lives in France. A respected international journalist with a lifetime's work behind him, covering wars mostly, 39 to 45, Korea, Vietnam. In Australia, his name is a dirty word. Many think he should stand trial for treason. Some would like to see him hanged. And why? Because for most of his working life, spanning the great post-war confrontations of capitalism versus communism, nationalism versus imperialism, Wilfred Burchett chose to report from the other side. For this, he has paid a price. Now in his 70th year, Wilfred Burchett lives in Paris with his wife and 3 children. He lives in self-imposed exile, and hopes that when time has tempered passions and polemics, history and his own country will be kind to him. Wilfred Burchett grew up in a small Australian country town. His father was working class and a Methodist lay preacher. With little more than a primary school education, Wilfred Burchett was 17 when the Great Depression hit Australia. The family business went bankrupt. The bank took away his parents' house, so Burchett hit the road, joining the vast, trudging army of the unemployed. Capitalism no longer seemed to work. It was discredited. And this was to influence a whole generation of men and women, not least of them, Wilfred Burchett. In Indochina, colonial France found itself bogged down by a motley group of Vietnamese revolutionaries. The French made the mistake of underestimating their adversaries. It will cost them dearly. 10 years later, the United States will make the same mistake and pay an even greater price. Always sympathetic to the underdog and acting with the instincts of a good journalist, Wilfred Burchett, on his way home from Korea, decided to visit Ho Chi Minh's forces.
On the way down to Vietnam, listening to the French radio, the military communiques were all dealing with a place called Dien Bien Phu. The French had occupied this place well behind the Viet Minh lines, and from there they would fan out and actually capture the Viet Minh headquarters. When I got to the headquarters, figure coming out of the jungle, unmistakable figure with its wispy beard, and sure enough it was Ho Chi Minh. The French had reported several times that he was killed, but here he was coming out of the jungle with a cape across his shoulders and with a bamboo walking stick. He came into the hut, and after the formalities of asking about my health, I asked him, what is this place that Dien Bien Phu, the French are going on about, in every radio broadcast? And he took his hat, his sun helmet, turned it upside down on the table, on the bamboo table, and put his hand, he said, Dien Bien Phu is a big valley. It's surrounded by mountains. The cream of the French expeditionary force are there in that valley. We're around in the mountains. They'll never get out.
So your father was very well known as a journalist, to have been one of the first to protest against the war here in Vietnam. So how did he get into the subject of Vietnam?
Well, he reported the peace talks to end the Korean War, and when the armistice was finally signed, there was to be a conference in Geneva to finalize the agreements.
Exactly.
And including, at the last moment, Indochina was included in the conference as well. So he decided to check what's the situation in Indochina, and he ended up in President Ho Chi Minh's jungle headquarters just before the Battle of Dien Bien Phu.
Mm-hmm.
And he interviewed Ho Chi Minh, who just appeared from as he describes it in the film, this legendary figure that no one even, people were not even sure whether he was alive or dead, because the French kept reporting that, that he didn't actually exist. So he appeared from the jungle. And one of the questions my dad asked him was, what is this place, Dien Bien Phu? And Uncle Ho took off his sun helmet, turned it upside down, and said, well, this is Dien Bien Phu. It's a deep valley. The crème de la crème of the French military is there. Dien Bien Phu, the valley is surrounded by mountains. We are here on the mountains, and the French will never get out. And of course, that's what happened.
Right. So did he go into Vietnam with strong support for Vietnam?
I think he went to Vietnam with a great curiosity about Vietnam, and I think he left. I think his meeting with Uncle Ho created a great love for Vietnam and for Ho Chi Minh.
Right. So you would say that first meeting with Ho Chi Minh kind of formulated his love and his support later for Vietnam.
Yeah, I think there's something called love at first sight. You fall in love with countries. It happens. I mean, I felt back in love with Vietnam when I first came back into that. So I think that's what happened with my dad. And he always said that his greatest hero is Ho Chi Minh. And people used to ask you, are you a communist or whatever? He said, no, I'm a Ho Chi Minhist.
Ho Chi Minhist. Wow, and after that, his love was realized because he stayed here for 2 years with his family, as you said, at the invitation of President Ho Chi Minh.
He stayed 2 years, and also he went on reporting Vietnam till pretty much till the end of his...
later. Did he ever tell you, I mean, obviously he told you a lot of stories about the times he spent here in Vietnam. Do you recall some of these stories, other than the historic meeting with President Ho Chi Minh?
Well, the thing about my dad is what you could actually read his stories because he wrote about it. So and also he used to write absolutely wonderful letters home, which of course my mum read us, or when we got a bit older we could read ourselves.
1955 onwards, your father lived in Hanoi to observe the implementation of the Geneva Accords. Here he wrote some of the books and also articles that became very well known later. Do you recall some of these works that he wrote about the move of U.S. imperialism into Southeast Asia?
I recall very well because he was the first, well, the first, probably almost only journalist to go into the, to actually start reporting the American war before anyone knew about it, because it was a secret war. And I think he wrote quite an important book called The Fugitive War in 1963.
The Fugitive War?
Yeah, that's when he just went to the border areas of Vietnam and Laos, and when he witnessed how the Americans were escalating, because of course we know that Vietnam was partitioned and it was supposed to be eventually unified, and it was obvious the Americans had absolutely no intention to allow a united Vietnam. So he started reporting, and he really opened up the world to that reality, that there was actually a war going on, because no one knew about it.
Exactly.
And then, of course, it escalated, and then that's when he went to the actual liberated zones for 6 months, and wrote a very important book called The Inside Story of the Guerrilla War, which was published in the USA and was absolutely instrumental in drawing public attention, and also a lot of American politicians, that there was a real war happening, and there was a real people, more importantly, a real people resisting this war.
Saigon, 1962. In bloody street riots, the South Vietnamese openly challenged the authority of the corrupt military regime. Under the Geneva Agreement, free elections were scheduled to unite North and South Vietnam. Fearing a certain communist victory in the South, the Diem dictatorship, now openly propped up by Washington, refused to hold the elections. The long nightmare of American involvement in Vietnam was about to begin. Once again, Australia sent troops to fight with the United States. Once again, Wilfred Burchett found himself reporting a war from the other side.
My sympathy was with the Vietnamese people. They'd been fighting for their independence for literally a couple of thousands of years against Chinese and Mongols and Japanese and French. So when I heard there was fighting going on again, I wanted to go down and have a look at it, see for myself what was going on. And it was natural for me to go to see the National Liberation Front side of the thing. Enough people were covering that war from the other side, from the Saigon side. I felt the other side should be known and should be publicized, because I considered they were the genuine nationalists. They were the ones who were fighting for the country's true independence. It was not an easy thing for myself at the age of 52 to get involved in doing what the guerrillas were doing, forced marches and living on meager rations. So I had to go through a training exercise to prove that I could march quickly, that my legs and muscles were still good, that I could carry a pack, that I could live on rice and very meager rations in order not to embarrass the people with whom I would be traveling. I was the only outsider who had ever visited them, and this was true also of the war against the French. No outside journalist ever visited the South. So I was a sort of morale booster for them, that somebody from the other side had come down to have a look and see what their struggle was all about and share some of their difficulties and hardships and dangers with them. I wore the black pajamas of the Viet Cong and the conical straw hat in order to fit into the landscape as completely as possible. They started off by using bamboo spears, clubs, even stones, some homemade types of guns. They had an odd collection of firearms, some dating back to the early days of the French colonialization. Whenever I went to Hanoi, which was relatively frequent, I virtually always had a breakfast with Ho Chi Minh, and sometimes a formal interview, but normally just a long exchange of ideas. He was always interested in my travels and what I'd been doing. He would always start off by asking about the family, the children. That's where I used to meet him in the early days, especially if it was raining. Otherwise, it was out in the garden. President Ho Chi Minh, or Uncle Ho, is known to the Vietnamese people, was a very simple, modest man. He could have lived in the presidential palace, which used to be the palace of the French Governor General of Indochina. In fact, he chose to live in servants' quarters behind the palace. I asked him once here, I said, well, can I take some photos of you inside the office? And he was very embarrassed. In fact, I don't have an office. If it's raining, I work on a veranda here. And if it's fine, I work out in the garden. And it's true, he didn't have any office. In terms of his accomplishment and in terms of his human characteristics, I've never met a man like Ho Chi Minh. And I suffered a great sense of personal loss when he died.
In November of 1963, your father took a big journalistic experience, a challenge, when he spent 6 months in southern Vietnam with the Viet Cong guerrillas. And he stayed in their fortified hamlets and even traveled underground tunnels. So did he ever tell you about this experience? Do you recall some of his stories on this 6 months?
Of course, usually he told us funny stories about how he got... how there was a real serious situation where the South Vietnamese was really closing up on them, so they had to disappear into the tunnels, and he got stuck. He got stuck in the tunnel, so I had to push him, whatever. So eventually, once the alert was over, they had to get him unstuck, and then they had to destroy the tunnel because because of his bulk, because of his bulk, he destroyed the tunnel, so they had to redo it the whole thing. There was another funny story that he tells in the film about the scorpion bite.
The scorpion bite.
Yeah, where he...
so a lot of bugs around where in the forest, obviously.
But, you know, we were kids, so he always tried to make the stories interesting
kind of funny
and funny.
But at the same time, still giving you an idea of what was happening.
Of course, well, we know it was war, and war is not funny. And we know it was but we knew it was a just war, so it was...
for your father...
And because he was such a strong character, we were not even worried about him, because he was such a great hero, and we knew he was very well looked after by the uncles from the jungle.
Well, how about his experience, his further experiences with President Ho Chi Minh, or later, I heard also with General Võ Nguyên Giáp?
They were close friends, and as he says, every time he visited Hanoi, he would have breakfast, usually with President Ho Chi Minh and other leaders, and sometimes it would be a formal interview, sometimes it would be just a informal meeting, and he said that Uncle Ho always asked about us, the children, and always sends his greetings. So we always felt that we had this big
friend.
uncle called Uncle Ho. And I remember when I was at school in Moscow, and the teacher asked, who is the president of Vietnam? And I said, Ba Ho. And the teacher said, no, it's Ho Chi Minh. I said, but it's Ba Ho. So I felt. Yeah.
He was a very close
so he was like a big uncle, and then you had other uncles.
Wonderful. How about with General Võ Nguyên Giáp? Did he ever tell you any stories about his experience meeting with
Well, again,
general?
I would, we would read about it or see it on interview on TV, but of course we all knew that General Giáp was the great strategist and the great military mind that implemented Uncle Ho's overall strategic vision and for Vietnam. So it was like a big family to us, and Vietnam was an extended family. So there was always this very warm feeling, and I still keep this warm feeling. Vietnam to me is is something that is in the heart rather than in the mind. I mean, it's in the mind, but it's very strongly in the heart.
Strong in the heart.
Yeah.
You have a connection to it.
Very strong connection.
Wonderful.
Police asked students...
The Vietnam War split the Australian community in two. Burchett's reports were largely ignored by the conservative daily press. But his articles and books were read where they had the most impact, amongst the anti-war activists, both in Australia and overseas. Wilfred Burchett was still the only Western journalist consistently covering the war from the communist side.
I've come to believe over the years that my duties as a journalist go beyond my responsibilities to an editor or to a publisher, and that my duties as a citizen of the world go beyond my responsibilities only to my own country. In other words, I reject the my country right or wrong.
With Australian conscripts dying in the jungles of Vietnam, Wilfred Burchett's activities brought enormous resentment. In this climate, his repeated requests for a new Australian passport were rejected.
The Australian government went to extraordinary lengths to keep me out of the country. In 1969, for instance, my father was dying. He was 97, almost 97, and I asked to go back then on compassionate grounds, but it was refused.
I think that there are certain fundamental freedoms that a man is entitled to his opinions and to publish his opinions, and that a government has no right to deprive a citizen of his birthright.
In fact, it was not until the Australian government was changed, that is to say, the Labour government of Mr. Whitlam came to power, and on the very first day after he took over in Canberra, I got a telephone call from the Australian embassy, the Australian ambassador, Mr. Renouf, Alain Renouf, in Paris, to say he was very happy to be able to inform me that he'd been instructed by Canberra that morning to issue me with a passport, and asked when I was coming along to pick it up. I said, this afternoon, thank you very much, which I did, and I haven't had that problem ever since.
Visit this time to Vietnam, I heard that you have brought a selection of documents, photos to bring to the Vietnam Union of Friendship. Can you tell us a little bit more about these documents, these photos?
Well, they come from from my dad's photographic archives, and I've just been. It's quite an extraordinary collection of photos that he took that cover the early days in Vietnam, like 54, 55, that were taken when he was writing a book called North of the 17th Parallel. And then you have the photos taken during his many visits to the liberated zones, and then also photos of him with President Ho Chi Minh, and many other leaders, General Giap and Prime Minister Phan Van Dong, but also ordinary people, and some very telling photos about the effects of U.S. bombardments of North Vietnam.
Right.
So they're quite again, it's his unique ability to be on the spot and to see the real picture, and then to transmit it to to show it to the world.
Now, in these selection of photo, there was a passport, a photo of a passport granted to him by the government of Vietnam. Can you explain this passport?
Well, in 1955, actually just a month before I was born, my dad attending the Bandung conference. He flew there with Prime Minister Phan Van Dong. And on the way back, as he was crossing from China into Vietnam, his British passport disappeared. And then when he applied to the British authorities for a new passport, it's a bit complicated. He had a British passport. He was an Australian citizen. At the time, they could have anyway to cut the. Australian government refused for 17 years to renew his passport. So basically he was in Vietnam without a passport. And when he tried to register us as Australian citizenship, the government said no, refused. So the Vietnamese government issued him with this big document called a laissez-passer, tenant-lieu de passeport, which means basically it's an identity document that says that this person is who it is, and please
let him in.
Please, yeah, assist. So, but it was, of course, only valid for socialist countries.
Exactly, and so the Australian government denied him the right to renew his passport during 17 years because of this controversial issue that he was covering on the other side.
Indeed, to punish him. Well, yeah, to punish him for Korea and for yeah, basically,
and later,
basically running a story that was contrary to the official Cold War propaganda that say that communists are evil and we have to fight it wherever it is.
Exactly.
And the domino theory that allowed the U.S. and its allies to escalate the war and to bomb Vietnam and to napalm Vietnam and to poison the, you know, with defoliants. So governments just don't like to hear, to have anyone
related to
indeed
the communist side.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Your father obviously had a lot of challenges, as we said, with the governments, the Australian government, and it created kind of a discomfort, almost like a negative feeling, even from supposedly Australia, which is your country. So how did that affect the family life?
Well, of course, because he couldn't live in Australia, so we lived in different countries, like Moscow, when it was still USSR. Then we moved to Cambodia, to Phnom Penh, because my dad wanted to be closer to the action in Vietnam. So we were very lucky to live in this wonderful, peaceful Cambodia before, tragically, it got dragged into the war. We left just before Prince Sihanouk was overthrown, and you know, Cambodia was dragged into the war, and then we had the horror of the Khmer Rouge. Then we moved to Paris because the Paris peace talks had started. So my dad wanted to be closer to the peace talk, and of course, Paris was quite. I mean, I love Paris. I think it's one of the most beautiful cities in the world. But the one thing I was always missing is my own country. So eventually, when I settled in Australia, I thought, wow, that was after my dad died. But that wasn't easy either, because there was still this huge prejudice that follows me, and there is still this perception, and it's still perpetuated by some sections of the media and the sort of more right-wing conservative establishment, and that, you know, they have to keep this sort of traitor Burchett thing because it serves certain purposes. I mean, we have what we call the history wars in Australia, that everyone is trying to claim the history is politicized in Australia, and Wilfred is obviously one of the sort of punching balls for different versions of history. But I'm very comfortable with what my dad is. I think he's a great hero, but a great hero for humanity, not just for on a sort of nationalistic or you know, narrowly defined patriotic. He was a true internationalist, and he believed in socialism. He believed in the just cause of the Vietnamese people, and he stuck by them.
Right, and it's wonderful that he had a family such as yourself, your brothers and sister, and
my brother,
mother,
my sister,
who
my
really
wonderful
supported
mother.
him.
Yeah, absolutely. But we supported him because he was, apart from being a great journalist, he was a very wonderful and very warm human being with a fantastic sense of humor, and he was just great fun to be around.
Exactly.
He made our life brighter and more interesting.
3 weeks after Hiroshima, Wilfred Burchett landed with the first wave of American troops on Japanese soil. His official assignment, along with 250 other correspondents, was to cover the surrender ceremony on the US battleship Missouri. 249 correspondents obeyed that order. One man did not. Wilfred Burchett secretly boarded a civilian train and headed 400 miles inland to Hiroshima.
There was no city left. It was just dust. I went to a hospital which had survived in the outskirts of the city. These people were all in various states of physical disintegration. They would all die, but they were giving them whatever comfort could be given until they died. And the doctor explained that he didn't know why they were dying. I didn't know what name to give to this disease, so I called it atomic plague. What I'd seen was the end of World War II, but it would be the fate of cities all over the world in the first hours of a World War III. I felt staggered, really staggered by what I'd seen, and just where I sat down, I found some lump of concrete, I remember, that had not been pulverized. I sat on that with my little Hermes typewriter, and my first words, I remember now, were, "I write this as a warning to the world."
Before Vietnam, you mentioned that he was in Hiroshima. He was one of the first Westerners there the first Westerner there to become a journalist and to cover the event there right after the atomic bombing. Do you recall some of the stories that he told you as a kid covering those events?
The Hiroshima story I know as a history, but the fact is that he was the first Western reporter to go into Hiroshima, which is quite significant because during World War II he was with the, he covered it in Burma, India, etc., but he was with the American fleet in the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
And when they landed in Tokyo, he landed with all the journalistic corps, and then he heard about this big bomb that happened in Hiroshima, and something in his mind said that this is the big story. So when all the journalists went to cover the Japanese surrender, he boarded a train on his own and went to Hiroshima. He didn't know what it was. He knew there was a big bomb, but and he was staggered to see what happened.
Mm-hmm.
I think it totally changed his perception, because what he wrote this very famous article, headline, "I write this as a warning to the world." Exactly. And he described something called the atomic plague, that no one knew what it is. What he saw in Hiroshima was what the world would look like if there was a World War III.
Right.
So after that, his obsession was that
a warning to
any avoid that, stop that. And his last book, just before he died, was called Shadows of Hiroshima. It was his recollections about Hiroshima, and it was his testament to the world.
Seemed to be a man who was always on the move.
Yeah.
Always chasing after some story, even until his last days.
Well, he was he was a journal. That was in his blood, chasing stories. He liked it. That was his life. That's what he lived for. But what is interesting that he was also a journalist with a cause. Mm-hmm. So he didn't just he wasn't detached. Exactly. He was always accused of being too close to this or to that, but that was his choice. Mm-hmm. He covered stories in which he believed and that he thought were important. Exactly. And that is why it was important for the world to know them, not just a newspaper, an editor, or just to make headlines, but to alert the world to certain important issues.
So coming to Vietnam this time, George Burchett and his wife had the occasion to visit the Ho Chi Minh Mausoleum and also museum. He and his wife had the chance to kind of recall their father's dearest memories alongside the great leader, President Ho Chi Minh. So we'll get a chance to look at their visit.
I can always imagine how my father first met Ho Chi Minh, which was, just before the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. This very modest man, dressed like a peasant, could defeat not only the French but also the Americans. I think it was the man that made the greatest impression on him. So for all his life, he was inspired by Ho Chi Minh, and I could say that he worked very actively for the cause of Vietnam independence and reunification, and it makes me feel very proud to be part of that history as well, even though I didn't actively participate, but I grew up with it. So it formed me, my thinking and my feelings for Vietnam, for President Ho Chi Minh, and for all the Vietnamese leadership and the Vietnamese people. The greatness sometimes is not very big, but it can be small, but it's very strong and beautiful.
So during this visit, how has everything been? How has the reception of the Vietnamese people been towards you and your wife visiting?
Well, it's been to me, it's been quite overwhelming. So many people came to me, say, "Oh, I've read your father. Oh, I've met your father. Oh, I knew your father. I knew your father in all sorts of places."
Including the state president, is that right?
Including the president, who said, "I met your father in South Vietnam in 1964. Wow. I was a student in Saigon, and then I sneaked into the liberated zones, and that's where I met Wilfred Burchett." Mm-hmm. So and also what is wonderful is to be surrounded in such a friendly, warm atmosphere. It's very, very moving, very, very special.
The first trip back after you left Vietnam in 1957 when you were 2 years old, and then you came back. When was it that you first came back?
2006.
2006, and this is the second trip?
This is the second trip, yeah.
Wow. How do you perceive Vietnam today?
I perceive it as I feel it's young and very dynamic. That's how I perceive it. Overwhelmingly, there is some vibe in the air that I really sense a country forging ahead that is, but proudly, because it's won so many amazing victories, historical victories. Of course, independence, then Dien Bien Phu, then a victory over American imperialism, then overcoming the economic difficulties, and now seemingly on the right path to a very, very bright future. And I really, really mean it. That's what I feel.
Talking about the future, do you think you'll come back to Vietnam and spend more time here where you were born?
I'm actually planning to, early next year, to come back for a few months and start a art project, because I'm an artist.
An artist,
yes.
wow, wonderful.
And maybe make a film as well, and sort of reconnect with Vietnam and try to discover my Vietnam, because until now it was my Vietnam through my father's eyes and his experience, and which was in a way a shared experience, because we lived it too, but it was away from Vietnam. And now I want to feel just explore Vietnam, discover Vietnam, and take it with me, show it to people in Australia and maybe elsewhere.
Well, we look forward to welcoming you back to Vietnam,
thank
your
you.
home
I look
country,
forward to coming back.
and all of these wonderful works that you have in mind. We'll be looking forward to that too. Thank you so much for being in our studio today, sharing your stories of Wilfred Burchett, your father, and sharing his thoughts, his memories with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure. It's been a great pleasure.
You.
It's been a great honor to be here in Vietnam and in this studio to talk about a man I dearly love and truly admire, my father, Wilfred Burchett.
Thank you.
Thank
well,
you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was our edition of Talk Vietnam. We had a talk with George Burchett, who is the son of the world-acclaimed journalist, a great friend of Vietnam, Wilfred Burchett. That's it for our edition of Talk Vietnam. We'll talk more next time. Goodbye.